Since I made my character guide, I've completed another couple runs on Maddening, made some more spreadsheets, talked to a lot of people, and done some more math. So with that in mind, there are several units I wanted to change the placement of, and a few units who are staying in the same place, but who I want to talk about a bit further. Either about builds I glossed over in the first video, or addressing comments about their placement. To start with, you may have noticed I've also reformatted the guide. I changed no-brainer to always good deploys. The criteria is basically the same, but I changed it from no-brainer because I don't want anyone to feel like they need to use these units. All of them will be great contributors to any team, and they make the game easier, but don't feel like you have to use all 8 of them if there are other units you like better. In the first video, I had good with investment and good with low investment characters, which is usually a good framework for Fire Emblem games, but in Engage, everybody wants investment. Even units that come with strong combat and ready to contribute, like Panette, want expensive skills, forges, and rings. Some units need more investment than others, but you're going to be giving investment to all of your units in Engage, so I replaced those categories with generally good and good specific build/niche. Generally good units are units that can fill multiple roles or have multiple good build paths, whereas good specific niche units are good with one build or have multiple builds that largely fill the same niche. I also replaced the early and late filler categories with high and low effort filler categories. All of these units are useful for a chapter or two when they join, but require a little work afterwards to keep up with the units in the good categories. That doesn't mean that you can't use them, they just need a little bit more work if you want to take them to endgame. The project category is for units that require notably more resources than other units to excel. They don't have significant contributions in a filler role, and the payoff for using them may not be as good as you would hope, but they can be made useful with some love and care. Assumptions for this video are the same as last time, that we're playing at a pretty casual pace, but not doing skirmishes or grinding reinforcements. I'm going to talk more about bond rings in this one though compared to the last video. Lastly, I did not change the early game only category, that one's still the same. I'm not going to go over every unit again here, so the ones that I don't talk about are the ones where my opinion hasn't really changed since the last video, so go check that one out if you want to hear about those units. So let's start with the always strong deploys. I moved a couple units up here. The first one is Panette. Panette's strength is really high, and with a reclass into warrior, she's good to go. She comes with really high strength, enough that when she's critting, she's one-shotting most enemies in the game. This makes her a great candidate for a Vantage Wrath build. With Wrath and a crit engrave and a killer axe, along with her personal skill that adds 10 crit when injured, it's fairly trivial to get her to 90 to 100% crit, and that plus Vantage effectively gives her infinite bulk against one-range enemies, because once she's below the Vantage threshold, she will one-shot the enemies before they get a chance to attack. This is a good time to talk about Vantage, as I will be mentioning it on other units. Vantage is an incredibly strong skill for high-strength units. It's really easy to trigger. Even the base version just requires you to be under 50% health, which might seem a little scary at first, but it's a pretty trivial requirement to meet, and once you do, you're functionally invincible against a lot of one-range enemies that you'll be able to one-shot. There's going to be some that'll survive a hit, but a lot of one-range enemies you really can just one-shot with a Vantage Wrath build. You just have to make sure that you watch out for enemies with 2 range, as Vantage with a 1-range weapon won't help you with those. You can do the Vantage Wrath build on other units, but Panette is really well suited for it. She comes already having enough strength to fill the role, and a synergistic personal skill. Plus, her health is high enough that with Lagoo's friend from Ike, she becomes bulky enough to take a few 2-range hits when she has to. Panette will be one of your best boss killers and your best enemy phase unit with this build. Even if you don't want to give her Ike and one of the more competitive engraves, Panette still does really great with just a Vantage Inherit and a Forged Silver Great Axe, having enough strength to one-shot a lot of late-game enemies. I really recommend giving her Ike and the Crit Engrave though, she makes the best use out of both of them. Specifically, Panette does well with the Lin Engrave, which also gives her some accuracy help. In the last version of this list, I had Panette in high investment because she does want some competitive resources in the form of Ike and the Lin Engrave, but she's such a good user of each that I really think she should be getting those resources. Even if you don't want to give them to her though, she'll still do really well no matter what. Ivy is the other unit to move up to this category, and there's 2 directions you can take this character. You can give her a speed ring or a speed taker inherit, and this will help her get doubling, and that makes her one of the better magic carries in the game. These rings are in demand, but I think Ivy is one of the better holders of them. She has high magic, enough bulk to take a hit, and access to B-rank staves, so with a Forged Tome and speed help, she can take out a lot of enemies while flying and providing staff utility. That's pretty good, and without DLC, she's the only unit that can be filling the Flying Tome user role, except for Hortensia, who is more suited to a support role than a combat role. Ivy can also have some accuracy problems, but I consider these fairly trivial to fix. Supports help, there are multiple engraves that fix hit, and you can always inherit a plus hit skill or divine pulse if you're really out of accuracy engraves. I think Ivy's performance justifies the investment, but she's also great if you don't want to give all those resources to her. We can give Ivy no ring and shift her into more of a support role and she'll still do well. B-rank staves means she has access to some of the most important staves like Warp and Rescue, and also still has access to the important C-rank staves like Freeze and Obstruct. Plus, her magic will be high enough to provide good Thoron poke, so you can always just inherit Draconic Hex onto her once you get Corrin, and you'll have a great little support unit. Basically, Ivy is a great candidate to be your primary magical carry, but even if you don't want to use her in that way, she more than pulls her weight as a flying Staffer and Thoron poke unit. The only downside of Ivy is her low luck means she faces a lot of 5 to 10% crits, so you need to be a little careful with her, or she can end up costing you a time crystal use. This also makes her not very Iron Man friendly. Lastly in this category, I want to talk about Alear. In the last video, I talked mostly about Dragon utility, but I want to talk about their other builds and why you might use them too. The main reason you want Alear and Dragon is to use the Byleth ring. This is because Byleth's Goddess Dance ability on a Dragon unit gives all nearby allies +3 to all units, and that's stellar. However, there are other good Byleth bonuses too. Covert units, for example, give +5 speed, so if you have a Covert, you might consider a reclass option for Alear, and I think there are two that are worth talking about. One is Wyvern Knight. This will make Alear a competent combat unit, and since they're force deployed, that's a pretty good thing. Alear is an early game unit, so they have the chance to snowball their XP using Mercurius from the Marth emblem, and this can make their combat very good and lets them pick up some skills before you lose the rings in Chapter 10. The other option is Key Adept. This might seem a little odd, but Key Adept has an important synergy with the Lucina emblem. Bonded Shield, when used by a Key Adept, has a 100% chance to activate and blocks attacks for every adjacent ally. Additionally, Lucina's dual support ability provides an avoid bonus based on how many supported units are next to you. Alear supports everyone, so it's pretty trivial to create a situation where Alear is blocking attacks for 4 allies while enjoying a +90 avoid bonus to protect themselves, all while applying their personal skill to the 4 adjacent allies to boost their damage. That's a pretty strong setup. Notably, Alear is one of the only 3 units that can fill this role prior to getting Byleth, because there's no way to get Arts proficiency until then. Compared to the other 2 options though, Alear has the supports with everyone and a personal that buffs all their adjacent allies, so they're one of the stronger options. So basically, you can keep Alear in base class if you want to use Byleth on them, especially if you don't have a Covert unit. If you do have one though, Wyvern and Key Adept for Alear are great options. In the last video I talked about Corrin on Dragon units, but the more I've played, the less I think that's worthwhile. Access to multiple terrain types is great, but on most maps you'll end up using the same terrain type most of the time, and you'll miss out on having Draconic Hex on a unit that can apply it from 3 range if you have Corrin on Alear. So that's it for the always strong deploys, and good early game didn't change, so let's move down to generally good. Citrinne is one of the better Brodians, and in the last video I feel I overstated how bad her speed is. It is low, but if you put her in Mage Knight, she'll be able to double slower enemies with Chaos Style, and more if you give her a Speed Inheritor Speed Ring, and her high magic gives her 1-rounding potential. However, I'm still partial to the Sage build. In Sage, Citrinne's high magic makes her great for poking with Thunder Tomes and applying Draconic Hex, and she also gets B-rank staves in Sage, so you can have her loaded up with the Thunder Tome, Amend, and 3 utility staves. And there's always going to be something useful for Citrinne to do every turn, whether that's poking, healing, freezing, or warping. And her high magic and instant access to promotion make her better in these roles than a lot of the alternatives you have at the time. I also want to talk a bit about bond rings, because they're pretty relevant for Citrinne. Initially I wasn't using them, but it seems like most people are, so I don't want to leave them out of the guide. Citrinne does very well with 2 bond rings. The first one is Olwyn, who provides Dire Thunder, and Dire Thunder makes the basic Thunder Tome always double regardless of speed, even though they normally can't. With Citrinne's high magic doubling with a Forged Thunder Tome will 1-round a lot of enemies through the mid-game. You could even do something like throw an Eichengrave on it for 3 more might, since it will double no matter what. Towards the late mid-game, this will start to fall off, as Dire Thunder only works with a basic Thunder Tome, meaning you're stuck with its low base might of 5. Our other good option is the May Ring, which provides the Great Thunder skill. This makes it so that you deal 20% more damage when using any Thunder Tome, and that means we can upgrade to Thoron. This is a great ring to transition to when Dire Thunder isn't quite doing enough damage anymore. It can help you get some one-shots, or just improve Citrinne's poke for when she applies Draconic Hex. Citrinne is a very uncomplicated unit to use. Regardless of which way you go, Citrinne is a pretty straightforward unit. You either promote her to Mage Knight and work on her speed to benefit from her high magic, or you can promote her to Sage to apply Draconic Hex while dealing good poke damage, or roll on the Bond Ring gotcha. Amber hasn't moved since the last version of this guide, but in that guide one of the options I touted for him was Halberdier, and I don't think that's the best way to go anymore. At the time, I was trying to look at how to get Amber to double with his really high strength, but here's the thing. Amber's strength is so high that he doesn't really need to double. With a Forged Silver Great Axe, Amber one-shots half the enemies in the late game, and with a crit build he one-shots almost everything. He takes a little bit more work than Panette since you actually have to level him, but you can easily use both. Throw Amber in Warrior, inherit Vantage and Wrath, give him whatever crit engrave you didn't give Panette, and you're good. You now have another boss killer that can handle most one-range enemies on enemy phase and delete almost any enemy on player phase. This way you don't have to worry about setting up for pincer attacks or investing in his speed. Plus he can kill some flyers with the bow access and chain attack if you need him to. If you do want to patch his speed though, Wolf Knight is probably a good option. It gets his speed high enough where a speed ring or skill inherit can get him to doubling some enemies, and he'll be stronger than other Wolf Knight options because he has solid base strength and is tied for the highest strength growth in the game. I'm partial to the warrior build, but you really can't go wrong either way. Having high enough strength to one-shot enemies is a really nice feature for Amber to have. Another unit that hasn't moved, but I have a quick note on, is Merrin. If you want to use Merrin long-term, you should probably get her out of Wolf Knight. She's fast enough without it, and her strength ends up very low in that class. I like her in Warrior because her magic is high enough to one-shot flyers for the entire game with the Radiant Bow, and her strength becomes respectable enough to deal damage with bows and axes. You can also put her in Wyvern to fix her strength, but I like Warrior since it allows her to make some meaningful contributions with her higher than you might expect magic. If you just want to use Merrin as filler for a handful of chapters, Wolf Knight's great, as Forges will help her to do a lot of damage, and you don't have to worry about fixing her strength for endgame if you aren't deploying her past the mid-game. So those were the generally good units that I wanted to talk about. Let's carry on to the good specific build/niche category. Framme is the first unit I want to talk about, and I moved her up because it turns out that Bondage Shield is really strong on a Key Adept. Framme already has great utility in the early game as one of your only staffers, but she's also a great candidate for Lucina Bondage Shield strats, and this is for a couple reasons. First, she is one of the only people that can do it when Lucina arrives. Your only other options are Alear and Jean until Byleth comes to provide arts proficiency. So that's 3 chapters where Key Adept Lucina access is restricted, and it's pretty good in chapter 13. Plus, Framme is much easier to get to promotion in a timely manner compared to Jean, and Alear may want to stay in Dragon or go Wyvern, so for a lot of teams, Framme is the easy choice to slot into this role. Second, Framme has a pretty decent support situation. It's not as good as Alear supporting everyone, but she has supports with a lot of good units like Kagetsu, Alear, and Chloe, so she will often be getting a good avoid bonus from Lucina. She synergizes even more with Alear since her personal skill gives both of them avoid plus 10 when they stand next to each other. You can pretty easily get Framme to where she has high avoid and provides 100% Lucina Bondage Shield, and that's a great role to fill. After chapter 14, you can fill this role with other units, and depending on who your carries are, a different unit might have more or better support options. Alternatively, you might be doing a team where flyers are your main carries, in which case you want Lucina on a flyer, but Framme will always perform respectably as your Lucina user, and her staff utility is always appreciated. Next up we have Fogado, who didn't move but who I want to talk about a little bit. In the previous video, I recommended Cupido for Fogado, and I want to give a little more respect to Warrior Fogado. Warrior Fogado immediately has a 6-point strength lead on Cupido Fogado, and the magic remains high enough to hit one-shotting thresholds with a Forged Radiant Bow and a little help in the form of a tonic. Plus, he gets chain attacks and axes in Warrior. The reason I don't like Fogado in Warrior, though, is because he gets a little lost in the shuffle. He can perform well in this role, but Merrin does it better even with the Radiant Bow, and you have other better warriors that you want to use for physical bow use. So he's not bad in Warrior by any means, but if you want a warrior, there's a variety of better options. Cupido is interesting in that it gives him enough magic to one-shot late-game flyers with ease, and it also gives him very high speed, hitting 34 in the late game. Combined with 11 build, this makes him a good candidate for doing things like using the Brave Bow with Erica. And this is often enough to make up for his lower strength in Cupido. Combine this with the extra point of move, and Cupido Fogado carves out an interesting little niche for himself as a mobile unit that can one-shot flyers and squishier enemies, and not many units can really do that for as little investment as Fogado requires. Some units can one-shot flyers in Bow Knight with the Radiant Bow, and some can quad with the Brave Bow, but most units can't do both without help, and Fogado is pretty close to being able to do both just on his own. Neither build will disappoint you, and both help Fogado fill the important niche of one-shotting Wyvern Knights with a Radiant Bow, and he can do that from the moment he joins to the end of the game, which makes him a good choice to be your main flyer killer. Next up we have Goldmary, who also didn't move, but I want to talk about another build on her that I didn't discuss much in the first video. She's very bulky, and if you're in the market for a tank, you can reclass Goldmary to Great Knight, and she ends up with a defense in the 40s, which is pretty nice. However, I'm not fond of this build because she doesn't do too much else besides take a hit for you. In contrast, our other enemy phase units like Panette and Amber are leveraging Vantage and one-shotting enemies, which leads them to A, have more productive enemy phases, and B, in many cases take less damage because they aren't taking any damage from one-range attacks. Goldmary just doesn't have the strength to do those builds, so her unique utility as a Great Knight is basically just blanking two-range physical attacks, which is cool, but I don't find it to be that important. In a game with defensive resources like Bondage Shield and Ike and Vantage, I just need my defensive units to do a little more than just be tanking, and that's the main thing that Goldmary brings to the table. For that reason, I prefer to just leave her in Hero. She comes 2 levels and 200 SP away from having Dual Assist and Brave Assist, and that alone is good enough for her to contribute for the rest of the game. Her defense in Hero is still pretty respectable. She ends the game with defense around 30, so she can take a hit in a pinch if you need her to. The extra chain attack from Hero may not sound like much, but when you combine it with Lucina's Dual Assist Plus, it basically means enemies in Goldmary's range functionally have 10% less HP, as she only misses both chain attacks 4% of the time. Even if you don't get her Dual Assist, you can still set up the chain attacks easily with a Javelin, so basically, Goldmary can contribute in Hero just by existing. She doesn't need many kills or forges or a good emblem, and she comes with her own SP for the skills that you want, and this makes her a great fit for the 11th or 12th slot on your team. Next up we have Lindon, and he's kind of a funny unit. He joins later in the game, but with 2000 SP and a decent magic stat, and this makes him fine filler, but it also makes him a prime candidate for kind of a weird reclass. We can make Lindon a sniper or bow knight and hand him the radiant bow, and he has enough magic to one-shot every flyer in the game, maybe needing a tonic in the last few chapters if you didn't give him many levels. Sniper is an interesting one because it also gives him access to the covert typing, meaning his Astra Storms have 20 range. You can spend his starting SP on Draconic Hex, and boom, you have a sniper that can apply Draconic Hex from 20 squares away. This means if you're doing something like Micaiah warping for a boss kill, you can warp 1 more combat unit instead of warping 2 combat units, a dancer, and a unit to apply Draconic Hex. Lindon's personal skill that gives him crit when he's using a lower level item also makes him a funny Dire Thunder user if you feel like rolling on Bond Rings. The personal is also good for the bow build since he will be primarily using the Radiant Bow, which is a C rank bow. Basically, if you're getting towards the end of the game and you realize you don't have a good answer for late game high defense wyverns, or you want an easy way to apply Hex for some of the late game warp skips, you can totally reclass Lindon and have him one-shot the flyers and apply Hex to those bosses, no problem. Lastly, in our good specific builds, we have Saphir. Saphir may not seem exciting at first glance, but she comes with enough strength to do well in a Vantage Wrath build, or just a Vantage build involving a Silver Great Axe. She doesn't end the game with as much strength as Amber or Panette, but she'll usually be one of the strongest units on your team when she joins, and that makes her a great candidate to be a second Vantage warrior for basically no effort. She also comes with 2000 SP, so it's really easy to pick up Vantage, or some extra mobility with Canter, or some backup utility with Dual Assist Plus. This is especially nice in the late game as there are a few maps that split your army into 2 groups at the beginning, and having a strong warrior in both groups to deal with worms, enemy phase, and chunk bulky enemies is pretty valuable. And Saphir has the strength to fill those roles pretty easily on join, so if you aren't using both Amber and Panette, or even if you just want a third warrior, Saphir can fill that role very well. After this category, we have filler units that take some additional effort to go to late game, and when I say additional effort, I mean beyond what the units above them need. All of the units above are either great when they join, or take very little time to become good and can perform well without being showered in the game's best resources, or they can take resources and perform uniquely well in the mid and late game. The filler units all make good contributions when they're force deployed or when deployment options are limited, and you should absolutely use these units around when they join, but they need a little more help to make contributions in the mid to late game. Either they need to use competitive resources, or they need a little babying before they start being solid contributors, or they simply perform a little worse than the above units in the late game. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't use them, especially if you like them, just be prepared to give them a little love so they don't fall behind the rest of your army. I split the categories into low effort to bring to late game and high effort to bring to late game, and the main differentiator here is how close the unit is to promotion when they join. Salene's performance in the late game, for example, isn't that much different than Clan's, but Clan comes at level 1, so it's a little trickier to get him the experience you need to promote him without giving him Mercurius or Micaiah, both of which are resources that basically everybody wants. And these categories have largely remained the same, but the one unit I wanted to talk about here is Rosado. The only unit I really want to talk about here is Rosado. Rosado's stats aren't too impressive, but Erica access makes him pretty helpful on his join map, and he's fast enough that you can get him to doubling many enemies if you just switch him onto weapons that don't weigh him down and maybe give him a tonic or a meal. From there, he comes with enough SP to pick up a useful skill, and he can be making some contributions pretty quickly. Still, he'll probably be worse than any flyers you've already been training, and he doesn't end up that much better than them in the endgame. So the main use case for Rosado is that he's an extra flyer that can afford some good skills and be made combat capable. And if you don't already have some flyers, or if you just want another one, Rosado can fill that role just fine. I also got a lot of comments about Alchrist in the last video. Enough that I made a whole video talking about him, so you can check that out in the video description if you want to hear more about why he's here. Lastly, we have the project category, and this is for units that don't have an immediate use in a filler capacity and also need some extra resources compared to other units to be endgame ready, or don't perform that well in the endgame even if you do train them. I didn't get too much pushback on putting Jade or Bunei here in the last video, but there were a lot of comments about Timerra, so let's talk about those. Most people seem to agree that at base, Timerra isn't that impressive. She can't do much on her join map, and she's weighed down by the weapons she starts with, and there's no force deployment for her after that, so it's easy for her to hit the bench. However, I've seen two cases made for using Timerra and giving her resources to make her late game ready. One is her solid mixed bulk, and the second is her offense with Sandstorm. I want to start with her bulk because I think it's a little less impressive than people are thinking. At internal level 35, Timerra has 27 defense, 17 resistance, and 30 speed. For comparison, Hero Goldmary at internal level 35 has 29 defense, 18 resistance, and 27 speed. And Hero Goldmary is not so bulky that she can take a bunch of hits. Ike will make either of them very tanky, but that's true of everyone that has pretty good bulk. Goldmary also has slightly higher strength than Timerra, so she'll also be doing a little more damage in the late game as well. And the reason I use Goldmary as a comparison point is because most people do not find Goldmary's combat to be that impressive, so my hope here is to show that Timerra's combat is not as impressive as you would hope it would be in the late game given that she has a weak start. So let's take a look at Sandstorm. Timerra has 28 dex at internal level 35, so when she doubles, she has a 48% chance of triggering Sandstorm at least once, and an 8% chance of triggering it twice. This means 52% of the time she has very similar combat to Hero Goldmary. When she does trigger Sandstorm though, she deals damage using 150% of her defense instead of her strength, so let's see what that looks like. With a +5 Fencelir against Chapter 24 enemies, we can see that she often fails to kill even if she Sandstorms twice. It's difficult for her to use a stronger weapon too because her build will cause her to be slowed down if she's using a heavier lance. Let's say though that we give her the Lin Ring so that she's fast enough to double things even when weighed down. This is her performance with a +5 Brave Lance for maximum Sandstorm chances. In this case, she still needs 2 Sandstorms to kill most enemies except for the Mage Knight where she just needs 1. The problem is a lot of units can one-round almost all of these enemies with a resource like the Lin Ring and a +5 Forge. It's just not impressive for a unit that also isn't great on join. We can level her up and give her a bunch of resources, but a lot of other units are good when they join and end up just as good or better with a bunch of resources pumped into them. Now, I do want to give credit to Timerra for her personal. Racket of Solm reduces the crit of nearby enemies by 5, and that's actually really nice, especially if you're playing in an Iron Man. Lots of enemies have a small crit chance, and Timerra saves you from that more often than you might think. It's a nice niche that no one else can really imitate. Overall though, Timerra can be a contributor if you like her and want to invest in her, but there are other units that can use that investment just as well and who have stronger starts. So those are my revisions to the character guide. Did I miss anything out, or am I overrating someone? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you liked the video, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload, and if you want to chat more about Fire Emblem, consider joining the community Discord. You'll find a link to that in the video description, so check that out if you're interested, and have an awesome week.